I bought my first Japanese knife about 15-ish years ago. It was a Moritaka Ishime 240mm Gyuto. It's one of the most handmade Japanese knives you can buy, and it's crazy. I love it. I use it all the time. I have spent so much time talking about knives and, more importantly, answering questions for people who don't know anything about knives that I figured I'd compile the top 10 things that I wish I had known maybe before I walked into a Japanese knife store. If you're shopping online or you can't make it into a Knifewear store, you might not get the information that you want before you get your first Japanese knife. If you're buying a knife in Japan, unless you speak really good Japanese, you're not going to know any of this stuff. So today, I'm going to cover the top 10 things that you should know before buying a Japanese kitchen knife. Number 1, like I said, that first knife I got was from the Moritaka family. They've been making knives for 730 years plus. So a lot of these come from families that have been making knives for a very long time. While they don't all have that long of a lineage, the tradition of knife making in Japan has been carried through centuries and improved along the way. And so every knife that we see here today, you can trace back in some way to the history of knife making in Japan. Chances are, if you're looking for a Japanese knife, you might have already known that, right? We all know about samurai swords, they're cool. That's what gets most of us into the idea of buying a Japanese knife. If you want to learn more about the tradition of Japanese knife making, check out our 2 documentaries, Springhammer 1 and 2. They're great interviews with the folks that make our knives, and you'll learn a lot about the tradition that goes into them. Number 2, Japanese knives are made from harder steel than most other kitchen knives, especially your run-of-the-mill, IKEA, Cutco, Henkel's, that kind of stuff. Those are all great knives, but they're made from much softer steel than a Japanese kitchen knife. What harder steel is going to allow you to do is to hold a finer, sharper edge for a much longer time. That means when you cut through a tomato, it's going to glide through the skin and it's not going to fight you. When you cut through something dense like a potato or a squash, the blade's thinner and so it's going to glide really smoothly. And they're just a joy to cut with, which gets you inspired to cook because it's no longer a pain in the ass, and your knives stay sharp much longer, so you don't have to spend as much time sharpening, and they're not dull every time you go to use them. That brings me real nicely up to number 3, which is that harder steel is more delicate. You may think of something harder as being stronger, right? We think of diamonds as super tough, but in fact, the harder something is, the more fragile it gets. Think about glass. It's really, really hard, but it can shatter. Japanese steel is very similar. Because the steel is so much harder and thinner than what you're used to, these knives are more delicate. Now, most knife makers in Japan make a knife that looks like this, where you can see a line close to the edge there. And what that shows you is that the knife is made with 3 layers of steel. They call that sanmai. Basically, you have the really hard core steel in the middle that does the hard work. Then you have 2 softer pieces of steel on the outside. And those act kind of like a security blanket to keep the steel protected. And so if you drop the knife, it's not going to shatter. That having been said, you still have really hard steel at the edge. And so you have to be careful when you're cutting that you don't cut through a bone or something frozen. Even a really woody squash stem can chip your Japanese kitchen knife. Now, with all that in mind, a knife that holds an edge much longer is going to be much safer as long as you use it properly. Now, with all of that info about the steel in mind, how it stays sharp so much longer, that brings me to number 4, which is that Japanese kitchen knives are going to be much safer, providing you use them properly. See, a blade that stays sharp much longer is much more likely to be sharp when you go and use it. When you cut with a sharp knife, it's going to go exactly where you point it. If your knife is dull, it's going to fight on the skin of a tomato or a squash, and it's more likely to go in the wrong direction. Now, much like a Ferrari, if you point it in the wrong direction, it's going to go there. So you need to be careful when you're using a sharp knife to keep your other hand out of the way. I would recommend checking out one of our many knife skills videos, and we start all of them by saying you should always make a claw with your opposite hand. A sharp blade is going to cut much better by sliding gently, and so you don't need that extra force to push down into the food. Now, since we're still on the topic of steel, I want to talk a little bit about the different kinds of steel that Japanese knives are made of. I'm not going to get into naming them all because that would take me an hour, but there are 2 main categories of knife steel. There is stainless steel, which we are all familiar with. Keeps an edge great, doesn't rust. There is also what's called high carbon steel. This is a more traditional type of steel. It's got fewer elements in it, which makes it just a more simple steel recipe. Basically, it just means it's easier for the blacksmiths to work with, and it can get a little bit sharper than a lot of stainless steels. The big difference that you're going to notice is that carbon steel knives can rust. And if you don't take good care of them, they will rust. Because there's nothing in the steel protecting it from oxidization, you cut any food, but especially something acidic like an onion or a tomato or a lemon, and it's gonna start reacting with that steel right away. And if you leave that for even a few minutes, you'll walk back to a rusty knife. So why would you even want to use one of these? Well, a lot of makers work exclusively with high carbon steel. So if you want a knife from a specific maker, you might just have to get that. Some people prefer high carbon steel. They either feel it gets sharper or just feel like it has a little more character to it. You know, I'm the kind of hipster that likes seasoning carbon steel pans and polishing my boots and listening to vinyl records. And if you're that kind of person too, you might love a carbon steel knife because they're gonna change and develop with age. If you're getting your first Japanese kitchen knife, especially maybe if you're not the best with maintenance, go for something stainless steel. And if you're buying a gift, almost always pick stainless steel. But if you're buying a knife for yourself and either you've got a couple of knives already, you know how to take care of them, or you want to try something just really cool right off the hop, if you take good care of it, it's going to reward you with an incredible edge and just really cool looks that are completely unique to you. Now, I just hinted at it, but point number 6 is that Japanese kitchen knives require a little more care than some of us are used to. A lot of folks I know, especially, you know, people I grew up with cooking, they would throw their knives in the dishwasher. Now, a dishwasher is not a good place for anything that you care about, but especially a kitchen knife. And that goes for any kitchen knife. Even stainless steel can rust if you put it in the dishwasher. It's actually a great environment to rust your knife. Worst case scenario, what'll happen to a stainless steel knife, the wood handle will get dried out, the steel might rust a little bit, but worst of all, the edge is going to get banged around and dinged up inside the dishwasher as that wash cycle progresses. And so you're going to end up with a knife that is dull, maybe chipped, rusty, with a sad looking handle. If you do it enough times, the handle can fall off or crack, and the steel can get really, really bad. We can fix that. It's great if we don't have to. A carbon steel knife will just be an entire bucket of rust if you let it go. So when you have a Japanese kitchen knife, wash it by hand, store it in a way that's going to keep the edge and you safe. For some people that's displayed like this, for other people that's in a blade guard, put away in a drawer. Just make sure that knife's not banging around loose in a drawer and that nobody that shouldn't get their hands on it can grab it. And finally, just make sure you're cutting on wood or plastic. A lot of folks don't like plastic these days. I prefer a wood cutting board because they're beautiful and they're naturally antibacterial. Avoid cutting on stainless steel, titanium, granite, glass, bamboo can even be quite hard. Those composite Epicurean boards, those are all gonna be super hard and they're gonna dull your knife much faster. If you want to learn more about how to care for any knife, but especially a Japanese knife, check out the video that I did about basic knife care. All right, now we're going to get a bit more into how these knives are made. First up, you know, I mentioned those traditional handmade blades like the Moritaka Ishime or this Homura Gurin from Doi-san. These are knives that are made by one person or a small group of people. Another great example of that would be this Masakage Kumo, made by Ikeda-san and his apprentices. My personal favorite blacksmith, Masashi Yamamoto. He is one of the best in the world. He has the most extreme attention to detail and fit and finish, and his standards are insane. So if you can get a knife from him, if you can afford it, they're phenomenal. The guys that are doing it nowadays by hand, they are still doing it with a lot of modern equipment to speed up the process. What we're seeing a lot of these days is knives that are forged by a machine and then the rest of the work is done by hand. And so a machine will go in and either, you know, punch out the steel. There's roll forging, which can give the blade a really nice shape and still give the same effect to the steel that forging can cause. But then you have a craftsperson, probably a team of craftspeople, that are doing the rest of the work by hand, shaping the blade to the exact shape they want, grinding the bevel, polishing it, sharpening the edge by hand, putting on the handle. And so you get a lot of great knives that to the average person might be a lot more affordable and are going to perform incredibly well. When you forge a knife and heat treat it by machine, you are getting way more consistent than most humans can get. Some guys like Masashi-san are just as efficient as a machine is. But for the most part, you're going to get one of the most consistent products and still done with a lot of handwork by a machine forged knife. But if you're looking to get a knife that kicks ass and doesn't break your budget, this might be the way to go, especially if it's just your first Japanese knife or you're giving a gift. If you want to learn more about the specific ways that knives are forged, either by hand or by machine, I did a great video that breaks it down in more detail. Speaking of videos that I have made recently, I just did one the other month talking about different types of knife handles. Now, if you're watching this video, you've probably seen this style of handle before. If you were born in the 60s or 70s, The Henkel sales guy at the mall probably told you that a full tang handle is a sign of quality, and you should only ever get a full tang knife. We still get a lot of people who expect that to be true. They also have a really nice weight to them. There's a lot of steel in the handle, and a lot of people feel more confident with that weight in their hand. And to some people, they're just familiar. My grandma's been using this handle her whole life. She's almost 100 years old. She's not gonna wanna switch to a different knife handle. So if you're buying for somebody else and they're very comfortable with the style of handle, maybe stick with it. But if you're handle curious, maybe you wanna change it up for a Japanese style handle. These are really, really cool. They're a piece of wood or 2 pieces of wood, and the steel tang, it's not a full tang knife. The steel tang just goes about half or 3/4 of the way into the handle. A lot of people worry, especially if they're used to that European style handle, that this is not gonna be durable enough. But again, if you're doing anything in your kitchen that causes this handle to break, you're using your knife wrong. No offense, but you are. If you're cutting meat, fish, vegetables, that kind of stuff, this handle is never gonna cause you any problems. Not every Japanese knife is ambidextrous. I did a terrible job of grabbing an example because these are all ambidextrous. And most Japanese knives are ambidextrous. They have a symmetrical handle, which is gonna fit in any hand really nicely. And more importantly, they are sharpened on both sides of the blade. If you've heard a little bit about Japanese knives, maybe you talked to your local sushi chef and asked him about it, you might have heard that some knives, some people even say all Japanese knives, are right or left-handed. Some knives, like this Meguro Bocho for butchering whole tuna, are sharpened on one side with a big obvious bevel, and the back side is flat or even slightly concave. You'll also see knives like the Yanagiba for slicing sushi, the Deba for butchering fish, and the Usuba for cutting up vegetables. Those are all right or left-handed knives. They have a heavy bias on one side, and they have almost no bevel on the back side. While those knives are very cool, and a lot of chefs and collectors end up with one or several in their collection, they are not the knife that an average home cook is going to or should buy. You should get a basic multi-purpose knife for your first knife, like a Santoku or a Gyuto. These are both chef's knives, they're just slightly different shapes and lengths. And lastly, number 10, I forgot, hey, there's different knife shapes. There are dozens of different shapes of Japanese kitchen knife. I have a video going into pretty much all of them by detail and which one you may or may not need. Many of us got a Henkel's knife block maybe for our first apartment or when we got married, and you have like 14 different knife shapes in there. You don't need a boning knife. Some people don't even need a carving knife. And so you should build your collection one piece at a time, or maybe you can start off with 2 or 3, but you want to build it intentionally with knives you're actually going to use. Most people start, as I said earlier, with a Santoku or a Gyuto. I might get canceled for saying this, but they're the same thing. They're just slightly different, right? This guy has a little bit of a flatter edge. It's a touch taller and it's shorter. This is longer. It's more inspired by a French chef's knife. It's got more of a gradual curve to the edge. I use them both pretty interchangeably in my home kitchen. When I worked in restaurants, I would use a bigger knife, even like bigger than this, about 10 inches for all of my prep work. And then when it got to service time and I was on a really tiny line, I would switch to a smaller knife. If you live in an apartment, you should probably use this knife. If you have small hands, you should use this knife. If big knives scare you, you should use this knife. If you wanna, use a bigger knife, get a bigger knife. It's up to you. All right, so that's it. I probably forgot something, but that is what I try to sum up in fewer words when a customer walks into the store. If I'm helping somebody choose a knife, we start by learning just a little bit about steel, right? A little bit about the different shapes and a little bit about the handles. So if you are shopping online, feel free to reach out to us because we'll be happy to help. But if you like doing your own research, start by trying to figure out what kind of steel is going to be best for you, what kind of handle, and what kind of shape. If somebody tells you you have to get this knife first, don't listen to them because it's up to you. There's no correct answer. It's just what feels right to you. So go off of the vibes. If you have questions, you need help, shoot me a comment down below. If you want to tell me I'm wrong, do that too. Give this video a thumbs up or a thumbs down, but subscribe to the channel either way. Okay. Peace.